Hello everybody, Dr. Jordan Taylor, undergraduate exercise science program director and associate teaching professor here at the University of Kansas. So on today's episode of Fitness Facts, we're going to be talking about your body's primary fuel source, carbohydrates. So we'll talk about what carbohydrates are, how we obtain carbohydrates from the diet, and we can also produce them endogenously inside the body. We'll talk about the functions of carbohydrates in the human body, the types of carbohydrates, how they're categorized as either simple or complex. We'll discuss fiber and fiber recommendations. A lot of Americans don't get enough fiber in their diet. We'll discuss glycogen, which is a storage form of carbohydrate in the body. We'll also discuss carbohydrate digestion and absorption, the skeletal muscle uptake of glucose. Muscle loves to use glucose as a fuel source, especially during higher intensity exercise, and glycogen as well that's stored in muscle. We're going to discuss the glycemic index, the glycemic load, and then daily carbohydrate recommendations for both just the general public and athletes. So what are carbohydrates? Well, you see it kind of in the name. Carb refers to carbon, hyd refers to hydrogen, and then you also have oxygen. So those are the three atoms that make up any carbohydrate. Now I have an example there on screen. So that is a glucose molecule, and you can see that glucose, if you look at those little blue circles, contains 6 carbon atoms, and then the red or kind of pink or hydrogen, there's 12 of those, and then you have 6 oxygen atoms. So again, carbohydrates are compounds composed of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, just to put it very simply. So how do we obtain carbohydrates? Well, we obtain most of our carbohydrates from dietary plant sources. Okay, so you think of eating things like potatoes, fruits, vegetables, breads, rice. Those are all carbohydrate sources. Some carbohydrate, some carbohydrate is found in animal products. So, like I said, most of the carbohydrates we obtain in our diet are from plant sources, but if you think about an animal product like milk, it contains lactose. Okay, and we'll talk more about lactose later, but that's also more commonly referred to as milk sugar. The liver and kidneys, they can make carbohydrate. They can produce glucose using non-carbohydrate sources. So this is in producing glucose from non-carbohydrate sources in the liver and kidneys. The term for that is gluconeogenesis. So if you break that word down, it means the creation of new glucose from those non-carbohydrate sources. Things like amino acids. We can use certain amino acids like alanine and glutamine to make glucose in the liver and to a lesser extent the kidneys. We can use glycerol, which glycerol is a component of triglycerides. So we store triglyceride in our fat cells, and through lipolysis, glycerol and fatty acids, which make up a triglyceride, can be released into the blood, and that glycerol can circulate to the liver, and then the liver can convert that glycerol into glucose, and you can then release that glucose out into the bloodstream to keep your blood sugar up. And also amino acids, like I said, alanine and glutamine. Maybe if you have some skeletal muscle tissue breakdown, like if you're fasting, maybe you're starving, you're stranded on a deserted island somewhere, you're not eating anything, you're going to have some skeletal muscle breakdown, and muscle is primarily protein and water. And you release the protein as amino acids into the blood, and those amino acids, alanine and glutamine, can circulate to the liver. The liver can take those, convert them into glucose, and then you can dump that glucose out of the liver back into the bloodstream so that the brain has fuel. The brain loves glucose. Neurons in the brain need that glucose to produce energy in the form of ATP. Your other cells of your body love to run on glucose. So keeping blood sugar, blood glucose levels stable is very important. And when we're in periods of fasting, starvation, or maybe you're doing a low-carb diet or intense exercise, this process of gluconeogenesis can get kicked on in the liver and to a lesser extent the kidneys. And then also pyruvate and lactate. Lactate is a byproduct that builds up during exercise. As we break down glycogen in our muscle cells, which is stored carbohydrate, we can build up lactate during very high intensity exercise. That lactate can be released out into the blood, and the liver ultimately can convert that lactate back into glucose, and you can circulate some of that glucose then back to your working muscles to keep fueling them during intense exercise. So it's a pretty cool process, this process of gluconeogenesis. And again, that's going to be more active in the liver when your carbohydrate intake is low. So like I said, if you're doing a low carb diet, maybe you're only eating 50 grams of carbs a day. That's very low carb. That's like a couple slices of bread for the whole day. Since you're not eating carbs and getting them from the diet, your body has to find a way to keep its blood glucose level up, because your cells, especially like the brain, really needs that glucose. And so you make it from these non-carbohydrate sources. You make that glucose from these non-carbohydrate sources in the liver. All right, so carbohydrates serve as a main fuel source for all cells and tissues of the body. And this is important to remember. 1 gram of carbohydrate is equivalent to 4 kcals or 4 calories of energy, right? Energy that's produced in the form of ATP, this is adenosine triphosphate, we form that from the breakdown of carbohydrates, all right, in our cells. So for instance, in your muscle cells, or in the brain, right? Carbohydrates can be broken down, and you eventually produce, at the end of this long pathway called glycolysis, you produce ATP from those carbohydrates, right? And then that ATP is needed for skeletal muscles to contract and relax. ATP is needed for neurons or nerves in the brain and other parts of the body to fire action potentials or nerve impulses. We got to have ATP for that. ATP is also an energy source that's used to fuel building larger biomolecules in the body, like maybe synthesizing proteins, right? So we need ATP. That's the currency, that's the energy our cells use, and we derive that ATP. We can derive it from carbohydrates. And we can also derive ATP from fats and even proteins, but our body really likes to derive it from carbohydrates, all right? And so like I mentioned, nerve cells in the brain rely predominantly on carbohydrate in the form of glucose. That's one form of carbohydrate. That's your blood sugar. So they like to use that for fuel. And then red blood cells, they solely rely on glucose, right? So the brain can also use other fuel sources like ketones, and you have other cells, muscle cells that can rely on fatty acids for fuel, but really the brain loves to uptake glucose and use that as a fuel source. And that's why if you've ever had, maybe you haven't eaten, maybe you're a little hypoglycemic, low blood sugar, you may feel like you're not thinking that well, not thinking clearly, your brain really loves that. So muscles, they rely on the breakdown of carbohydrate, glycogen, and glucose. So again, glycogen, all that is a stored, it's a bunch of glucose molecules linked together and stored in muscle, all right? So they rely on the breakdown of glycogen and then glucose entering the muscle cell from the blood to produce ATP to fuel intense physical activity during, high intensity exercise, right? So we need that ATP, again, for muscle contraction and relaxation, and we derive a lot of that ATP at higher exercise intensities from glycogen and glucose. At lower exercise intensities, we tend to derive more of our ATP from the breakdown of fats. So the basic single molecule of all carbohydrates is called a monosaccharide, all right? And all monosaccharides that are absorbed from the diet, they have 6 carbons, but they vary slightly in their chemical configuration. So they may look slightly different, but they all have 6 carbons. It's just the way the atoms are arranged may vary. The number of monosaccharides bonded together provides the basis for classifying carbohydrates, all right? So like I said, if you have anywhere from 10 to thousands of glucose molecules, which is a monosaccharide, bonded together, you form a big glycogen molecule, and that can be stored in muscle and liver, all right? Maybe you just have 2 monosaccharides hooked together, you form what's called a disaccharide, and we're going to talk more about those in a bit. The term sugar is used to refer to simple carbohydrates. Now, what are the simple carbohydrates? Those are your monosaccharides, like glucose, and disaccharides. An example of that you very commonly may ingest is sucrose, which is table sugar, right? The terms complex carbohydrate and starch, these are terms that refer to longer chains of monosaccharides that have been bonded together to produce what are called oligosaccharides and polysaccharides. So these longer chains of monosaccharides that have been linked together to form these oligo and polysaccharides, these are found in plants and plant-derived foods. So you hear like starchy carbs. You may ingest a lot of polysaccharides if you're eating, whole grains, breads, cereals, rice, potatoes. Those have a lot of starchy carbs in them, and those would be considered complex carbohydrates. This chart just kind of shows the breakdown, how carbohydrates are classified. So if we start just globally there, very general, you've got carbohydrates at the top, and then you can follow the 2 arrows down. We can divide those into simple carbohydrates on the left there. Simple carbohydrates can further be subdivided into monosaccharides and disaccharides. So monosaccharides are a type of simple sugar, one sugar unit, and there's 3 different ones listed there. You have glucose, fructose, and galactose, all right? Then in the next column over, you have disaccharides, which are also considered simple carbohydrates. Disaccharides are comprised of 2 sugar units or 2 monosaccharides that have been chemically bonded together. Okay, so for instance, sucrose, that is a disaccharide that's formed from 2 monosaccharides, glucose and fructose, right? So glucose and fructose come together, you form sucrose. Lactose is another disaccharide. I'll talk more about that in a bit. Again, found in milk. Maltose is also another disaccharide. And if we look at the complex carbohydrates over on the right side, these are longer chains of monosaccharides that have been hooked together. So if it's 3 to 10 sugar units linked together, you have raffinose and stachyose there. More commonly, the complex carbohydrates we think of that we obtain from the diet are starchy carbs that I mentioned previously. These are long chains of glucose molecules that have been linked together. That's what forms starch, like you would find in a potato or in rice, pasta. Glycogen, you can think of that, starch is found in plant products, plants that we eat. Glycogen is like starch, but that's how we store starch in our body. It's glycogen, okay? So in our muscles and liver, we can link together a bunch of glucose molecules in a chain and store all those glucose molecules as a polysaccharide known as glycogen in our liver and muscle. And then cellulose, this is a component of plant cell walls. Really, you can think of this as fiber, which we'll talk more about in a bit. All right, so simple carbohydrates. Monosaccharides, if we look at their structure, I mentioned on that previous chart that there are 3 of them, glucose, fructose, and galactose. Again, look at the atoms there. They all have carbon and oxygen and hydrogen. They're just arranged a little differently with their appearance and structure. So glucose, it's the first monosaccharide to talk about, also referred to as dextrose or blood sugar. It's the most important monosaccharide in humans and the primary one used as fuel by human cells. Glucose is readily absorbed from the diet. So again, we have enzymes in the mouth like salivary amylase. We have enzymes in the small intestine that'll break down larger carbohydrates like polysaccharides and starch that we eat in our diet. And then those enzymes can release free glucose from the small intestine to be absorbed into the blood. And then that glucose can circulate around, to our liver and to the different cells of the body to be used as fuel. Again, I mentioned glucose can be synthesized in the body from the digestion and conversion of other monosaccharides. So the liver can convert fructose, which is commonly referred to as fruit sugar. You find it in fruits, and also you find a modified form called high fructose corn syrup in things like soft drinks. But the liver can convert that fructose into galactose and glucose. Okay, so kind of an interesting process. Also, the liver, if you're really taking in a lot of carbohydrates every day, and you're not really burning much off, some fructose can get more easily converted into fat in the liver, which may not over the long haul be the best thing for you. And it just has to do with kind of the biochemical pathways. It's more easy to convert fructose into fat than some of the other carbohydrates. So glucose can be liberated from complex carbohydrate molecules such as starch. So again, you eat that potato, that pasta, enzymes can break down all those glucose molecules that are found in that starch, and they can be absorbed from the small intestine into the blood. And then glycogen, remember, that is stored in muscle and liver, and glycogen can be broken down. And in the liver, we can release free glucose molecules from that stored glycogen into the blood to help maintain our blood sugar levels. And during high-intensity exercise, we can also break down glycogen in our muscle cells through a pathway called glycolysis. There's like 10 enzymatic steps involved in that pathway, where glycogen ultimately gets converted to what's called pyruvate, and in that process, you release some ATP, which is energy for you to continue on exercising. The liver, as I mentioned, can create glucose from non-carbohydrate sources such as amino acids like alanine and glutamine, glycerol, pyruvate, and lactate. I talked about that process a few slides back. That process is known as gluconeogenesis. After digestion, dietary glucose is absorbed from the small intestine into the blood to serve as the energy source for cellular metabolism. For intracellular storage as glycogen, which again, we store glycogen in the liver and the muscle cells, or some can be converted to fat in the liver, although it's, again, like I mentioned, it's easier for your liver to form fat from fructose than it is glucose. We don't have a lot of glucose getting converted to fat. But again, some can, not only in the liver, get converted to fat, some can also, if you're in a very high caloric surplus, you may have some glucose in fat cells, because fat cells can take up glucose, and you may have some conversion of that glucose into fat in those cells. But again, you've got to be eating in a surplus and really not burning much off. Fructose, the next monosaccharide to talk about, also known as fruit sugar. So it's the sweetest tasting sugar found in fruits and honey. Dietary fructose is absorbed from the small intestine into the blood and delivered to the liver for conversion to glucose. All right. As I mentioned, the liver can convert fructose to fat when consumed in high amounts, and most of the fructose in Western diets comes from the consumption of high fructose corn syrup. So this is a cheap sweetener that's added to things like soda, candy, cookies, pastries, Pop-Tarts, certain dipping sauces, pancake syrup. I mean, you find high fructose corn syrup in all kinds of American food products, right? So it's a sweetener. It's basically just corn syrup that has been modified to increase the fructose concentration. Unfortunately, diets that are rich in high fructose corn syrup have been linked to health concerns like non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. So you start to accumulate, if you're eating diets that are really high in high fructose corn syrup, fat in and around the liver, and that can impair liver function, and the liver has a lot of functions. So you need a healthy liver, but again, high fructose corn syrup can be damaging there. Also, because high fructose can be converted into fat, it's more likely to raise your triglyceride levels in the blood. So triglyceride is a form of fat. High fructose corn syrup intake has been linked to insulin resistance. So this is where cells like your liver cells, your muscle cells, and your fat cells do not want to respond to insulin, and therefore they don't take in blood sugar from the bloodstream. So insulin, if your cells are sensitive to it, they listen to it, and when insulin knocks on the door of those cells and binds to the receptors on the cells, those cells will bring in glucose from the blood. But high intake of high fructose corn syrup can make the cells resistant to insulin's action, so they don't want to take in glucose from the blood, and then your blood sugar starts to rise. And over time, if it's staying high, then you could be diagnosed with diabetes if it gets above a certain level. So insulin resistance, it's not good. This is something that's you characteristically see in people with type 2 diabetes, okay? And in type 2 diabetes, because they are insulin resistant, they have high blood sugar, which again has been linked to a diet that's rich in high fructose corn syrup. So again, a lot of things going on there. Fructose from fruit, it's not the same amount. It's not as big of an issue, but a lot of fructose in these kind of refined products and soft drinks, typically want to avoid that. I don't want you to think that you should avoid eating fruit because it has fructose. It's a little bit different if the fructose is in fruit versus the refined products, all right? So, and plus when you eat fruit, you've got other healthy benefits like fiber, and so fructose in fruit, not as big a deal. Galactose, this exists in nature only in combination with glucose, all right? So galactose that's bonded to glucose forms the disaccharide lactose, and this is known as milk sugar, all right? So lactose is present in the mammary glands of lactating humans and mammals, and the liver can convert dietary galactose into glucose. And of course, if you're, I'm going to hold off on that. I'll talk about lactose and lactose intolerance later. We'll go to the next slide. All right, so let's look at this breakdown of disaccharides here. So sucrose is commonly called table sugar. That's a disaccharide that is formed when you link the monosaccharide glucose to the monosaccharide fructose. The next disaccharide, milk sugar found in milk and dairy products, is lactose. So this is a disaccharide formed when the monosaccharide galactose is bonded to glucose. And then maltose, this is a disaccharide more commonly found in like breakfast cereals. This is formed when a glucose is linked to glucose. It also plays a role in the production of alcoholic beverages. So again, sucrose, most common dietary saccharide, table sugar. Of course, it's abundant in most carbohydrate foods, but it's especially prevalent in highly processed foods. And most of you probably know, typical American eats way too many convenient and highly processed foods, and those are foods you want to avoid. Part of the reason you want to avoid them is because they are high in sucrose. And again, this has impacts on your blood sugar levels and like your overall health, okay? Lactose, this is the least sweet disaccharide, again, found in milk products. And then maltose, or malt sugar, this is found in grain products such as cereals, seed foods, and it's also used in the production, as I mentioned on the previous slide, of alcoholic beverages. Now, if we look at polysaccharides, these are the complex carbohydrates. So again, simple carbohydrates were the monosaccharides and disaccharides. Now, if we start linking a bunch of monosaccharides together, we can form these polysaccharides. So starch, again, found in complex carbs, potatoes, rice. There's two forms of starch. Amylose, which is kind of a long linear chain of monosaccharides, simple sugar units hooked together. And then amylopectin is another more branched form of starch. Glycogen, again, this is just a branched form of just a bunch of glucose monosaccharides hooked together, bonded together, okay? There can be hundreds to thousands of these glucose molecules linked together to form that branched glycogen polysaccharide. And that glycogen polysaccharide, we store that fuel source in our muscle cells and liver, okay? Cellulose, component of plant cell walls. This polysaccharide is also known as fiber, and we're going to get into talking about fiber here in a bit. So polysaccharide, if we define it, it refers to a carbohydrate substance that consists of 10 to up to hundreds or thousands of chemically linked simple sugar molecules. So both plant and animal sources contain these large sugar chains, Starch and fiber are the plant sources of polysaccharide. Glycogen is a polysaccharide composed of many glucose molecules, like I mentioned on the previous slide, and we store that glycogen in skeletal muscle cells and the liver. So we'll talk about starch now. That is the storage form of glucose in plants. And as I've mentioned, it occurs in high concentration in things like seeds, corn, and grains used to make bread, cereal, pasta, and of course, pastries. Who doesn't love those? It's also found in vegetables such as peas, beans, potatoes, and roots. And it exists in those two forms that you saw on the previous slide, amylose, that long chain of glucose units that are kind of twisted into a coil, linear chain. And amylopectin is the more branched form. Starch foods with a relatively large amount of amylopectin, they digest well and are readily absorbed in the small intestine, whereas the starchy foods that have a high amylose content, they tend to digest more poorly. And because of that, the rate at which sugar that's liberated from amylose, it appears in the blood at a slower rate. So fiber, this is classified as a structural non-starch polysaccharide. All right, and the National Academy of Sciences uses three terms to refer to fiber intake. One, we have dietary fiber. Dietary fiber consists of non-digestible carbohydrate and lignin that's found in plants, including digestion-resistant starch. Next, number two, we have functional fiber. That consists of isolated non-digestible carbohydrate with beneficial effects in humans. With functional fiber, it's interesting. There's bacteria that's in the intestine that can ferment a small portion of some water-soluble dietary fiber, producing small-chain fatty acids, right? So in the intestinal bacteria ferment this water-soluble dietary fiber, and they produce small-chain fatty acids that are absorbed and used as fuel for cells that line the intestine, called epithelial cells, or also white blood cells can use those small-chain fatty acids as fuel. Now, total fiber, what is that? That's a term that refers to the total dietary fiber plus functional fiber. That's your total fiber. So fibers differ widely in physical and chemical characteristics and their physiological action. The cell walls of leaves, stems, roots, seeds, and fruit coverings contain different kinds of carbohydrate fibers. As I mentioned, there's cellulose, hemicellulose, pectin. Those are some different kinds of fibers, okay? Dietary fiber sources are commonly referred to as water-insoluble or water-soluble. So we're going to talk about those differences here on this table, okay? So let's look at the types of fibers. Kind of that upper left-hand corner, you see soluble fibers. So these are gums, pectins, mucilages. So these soluble fibers, whenever we eat fruits, things like an apple, oats, barley, legumes, these food sources are high in soluble fibers. And why does that matter? Okay, well, there are some specific actions that occur in the body when you ingest soluble fibers. Soluble fibers delay gastrointestinal transit, meaning they slow the passage of food from the stomach into the intestine and through the intestinal tract. And so that can be beneficial because it leaves you in a state of feeling full for longer. So you feel satiated, you feel satisfied. You may not be as apt to overeat if you up your intake of soluble fibers because it takes longer to digest them and they move more slowly through the gastrointestinal tract. And they slow down the movement of just other food through the gastrointestinal tract. So again, you feel full for longer and you may be less likely to overeat. Okay, so it can help you kind of control your calories throughout the day. Soluble fibers also delay glucose absorption from the small intestine into the blood. So these soluble fibers can help you kind of control your blood sugar levels because glucose is not entering the blood as rapidly if you've got some soluble fiber there in the gastrointestinal tract. It's going to slow a slow release and absorption of glucose into the blood. Okay, so if If you're eating a lot of soluble fibers, you may not see these big spikes in blood sugar levels as a result of this delayed glucose absorption, which again, this can be beneficial for those of you that may be pre-diabetic or struggling with diabetes. Soluble fibers lower blood cholesterol. Okay, so this is kind of interesting. These soluble fibers can kind of bind up cholesterol that you may have eaten from the diet, and so therefore you don't get as much cholesterol entering into the blood. And there's data out there to suggest that if you have higher levels of LDL, low density lipoprotein cholesterol, you may be at greater risk of developing atherosclerotic plaques and cardiovascular disease as a result. But again, these soluble fibers can help kind of keep that blood cholesterol under control because they can bind it up so that it's not being absorbed into the blood. Insoluble fibers now, these are things like cellulose and hemicellulose. Okay, so if I go back to soluble fibers, these kind of absorb water and form like this gelatinous mass in the intestinal tract, whereas the insoluble fibers, they are not digestible. They are going to move through the gastrointestinal tract and really increase like fecal bulk. You can see that they accelerate gastrointestinal transit time, so they help to speed the movement of food and waste along through the GI tract. They slow the breakdown of starch hydrolysis, and they delay glucose absorption. So again, they can help manage blood sugar levels because insoluble fibers are going to delay the rate that glucose gets absorbed from the small intestine into the bloodstream. So it can help keep those blood sugar levels lower or stable. Now, where do you find these insoluble fibers? Well, whole wheat products, wheat bran, whole grain breads, cereals, and vegetables like green peas, beans, and cabbage are all high in insoluble fiber. And then also just the skin of vegetable and fruits and grains, that's where you find high levels of insoluble fiber. So again, there's some of the actions are slightly different, some similar. Overall, I would say you can't go wrong if you're trying to bump up your fiber intake. And plus, insoluble fiber, if you're having trouble pooping, your fiber intake, that's going to help with that. So no one wants to be constipated, right? Adequate dietary fiber intake is important for overall health. Like I mentioned, some of the reasons. It can help with lowering cholesterol and controlling blood sugar levels, right? It can help move food and waste along through the GI tract, can prevent constipation, right? So there's a lot of benefits here. It can help you feel full for longer, so you're not as apt to overeat calories throughout the day, right? And you need to eat less calories throughout the day, like if you're trying to lose weight. So a high fiber intake, especially whole grain cereal fibers, is associated with a lower occurrence of heart and peripheral artery disease, hyperlipidemia, that term means high lipid or fat levels in the blood, obesity, lower occurrence of that if you're eating high fiber intake, because again, you're going to be less likely to overeat because fiber helps you feel full longer. Diabetes, lower incidence of that if your fiber intake's high, because again, fiber helps control the rate at which glucose gets absorbed into the blood and helps keep your blood sugar levels stable. And of course, in diabetes, the hallmark feature of diabetes is high blood sugar, right? So you want blood sugar to stay low so that you're not diagnosed with diabetes. Digestive disorders, again, fiber can help with the passage of food and waste. And it also, if you take in a lot of fiber, you're less likely to develop things like colon cancer, rectal cancer, because again, fiber, it kind of acts as like a street sweeper. It's going to really clean, especially insoluble fiber, scrape the inside of the large intestine, the colon, and help to move waste along. And by doing that and moving that waste along, it helps to, you're less likely to develop cancers there like colorectal cancer. Adequate dietary fiber intake also maintains healthy gut microbiota diversity, which aids in the reduction of chronic diseases and inflammation associated with a Western diet. So again, and if I go back up to that point about heart and peripheral artery disease, that ties into the previous slide. If you're taking in a lot of fiber, soluble fiber can kind of bind up cholesterol, so you have less cholesterol entering the blood. If you have lower amounts of cholesterol in the form of LDL, then you're less likely to get LDL accumulating in the blood vessel walls. And if there's less LDL accumulating in blood vessel walls, that's going to allow for better blood flow, better overall cardiovascular health, because there's not an impedance to blood flowing, which is what you see in people with atherosclerotic plaques that are formed in cardiovascular disease. So again, high fiber intake can help reduce that cholesterol level in the blood. Less cholesterol in the blood, you have less atherosclerotic plaque, and basically it's going to keep your blood flowing and your cardiovascular health good. So fiber recommendations. How much should you eat? How much do Americans typically eat? The typical American adult does not eat enough fiber each day. I'd say, they show that typical American eats 18 grams of fiber a day. Some people even less. The Food and Nutrition Board of the National Academy of Sciences recommends the following daily fiber intakes for men and women. Men should consume 38 grams of fiber daily, and women should consume 25 grams of fiber daily. Now, if you're not eating a lot of fruits, a lot of vegetables, you're not getting fiber in the diet, oats, you can supplement, because it's hard for people to achieve those thresholds, 38 grams for men and 25 for women. You can purchase, powdered fiber supplements. A good one to get is a supplement that has a lot of psyllium in it. So this can help bump up your grams of fiber each day, just if you're supplementing with one of those powdered fiber supplements, one that's high in psyllium. All right, glycogen. So let's talk about this now. This is a large branched polysaccharide that consists of hundreds to thousands of glucose units that are linked together. There's two major sites where glycogen is stored in humans. I've mentioned this several times now. The liver is where we can store glycogen, right? So we eat some starchy carbs, potatoes, rice, whatever. It gets broken down into glucose. That glucose is absorbed from the small intestine into the blood. Then the glucose circulates to the liver and muscle. And then in the liver and muscle, we can start linking those glucose molecules together, store it as glycogen. Now, in the liver, adults can store approximately 100 to 120 grams of glycogen there. And in the skeletal muscles, all the skeletal muscle cells throughout the body, we can store up to around 400 grams. Some people may store a little less, some a little more. Also, if you're a trained athlete, you tend to store more glycogen versus somebody that's not as well trained. They may store less of this muscle fuel. So again, there's some slight differences there, but typically if you look at the amount that's stored in the muscle plus the amount that's stored in the liver, you store around 500 grams total, okay? Now, glycogen metabolism in muscle plays a major role in the control of blood glucose balance by the pancreatic hormone insulin. So as I mentioned earlier, insulin, basically after you eat a meal that's rich in carbohydrates, as you start to absorb those carbohydrates as glucose into the blood, the pancreas senses that and it releases insulin, which is a hormone released by the pancreas. Insulin then directs the skeletal muscle cells, fat cells, and liver cells to uptake glucose out of the blood and link it together, all those glucose molecules, and store it as glycogen, okay? So this occurs when blood glucose levels are high, like after a meal. Insulin also promotes skeletal muscle blood flow. It has a vasodilatory effect, so it opens up blood vessels, widens them, promotes blood flow to skeletal muscle. That helps stimulate glucose uptake, and then glucose metabolism and glycogen synthesis in skeletal muscles. Maximizing glycogen stores is important for aerobic endurance athletes and athletes involved in high-intensity training. In another episode, I'm going to talk about the importance of really maximizing, optimizing, increasing the amount of glycogen stored in your muscles and liver prior to prolonged endurance activity, because it's a major fuel source that you need if you want to perform well in aerobic endurance activity. Okay, it's also needed for high intensity exercise training, like repeated sprints, lifting weights, things like that. So we break down the glycogen that's in our muscle cells during exercise through a pathway that's called glycolysis. And enzymes are involved in breaking down the glycogen in this glycolysis pathway. And as the enzymes break down the glycogen, we produce ATP, which fuels muscle contraction for whatever activity we're doing. So now let's look at carbohydrate digestion and absorption. So you eat some food, let's just say a potato. The enzyme salivary amylase begins breaking down starch into shorter polysaccharides, maybe oligosaccharides. So you literally get some breakdown of carbohydrate occurring in the mouth because there's this enzyme released that's in the saliva called salivary amylase. Then in the stomach, salivary amylase is inactivated. No further carbohydrate digestion occurs there in the stomach. However, as that food, that potato, as it enters the small intestine, if you go to number 3 there, this is where the majority of starch digestion and breakdown of both polysaccharides and disaccharides occurs here in the small intestine. So the pancreas releases an enzyme called pancreatic amylase into the small intestine, and that pancreatic amylase breaks down starch into the smaller component parts, monosaccharides, disaccharides, and oligosaccharides. Then the digestion, if we go to number 4, the digestion of carbohydrates is completed by the enzymes attached to the brush border of the small intestine villi. So you're going to see this coming up on another slide. Here's where the disaccharides and oligosaccharides are broken down into the smallest simple sugar units, monosaccharides. Once we have that breakdown, the monosaccharides formed, those monosaccharides, glucose, fructose, and galactose, can then be absorbed from the small intestine into the bloodstream. Okay? And then the last part there, number 5, how does the large intestine play in all this? Well, fiber and other indigestible carbohydrates are partially broken down and fermented by bacteria in the large intestine to form those short-chain fatty acids that can be used as a fuel source. And you may also notice this, if you take in a lot of fiber, you may have more gas and some bloating feeling. And part of that is because of the action of the bacteria in the large intestine breaking down that fiber, and you get some gas that can be produced. The remaining fiber is excreted in the feces because, again, remember, insoluble fiber helps to increase fecal bulk. Now, this just shows that from the stomach entering into the small intestine, we have a larger, starch molecule there. Pancreatic amylase can break that down. And you see that we have disaccharides formed there, like maltose, sucrose, and lactose. And then in red, you see enzymes that can break down those disaccharides. So maybe you also had some milk with your meal. You would have high levels of lactose in the small intestine. So the enzyme lactase can break down that lactose into its component monosaccharides, galactose and glucose. If you had some table sugar, you'd have sucrose in the small intestine. So the enzyme sucrase splits that molecule apart, and you're left with glucose and fructose. And then maybe you had some cereal. It sounds like breakfast, right? Maltose. Maltase would break down, the maltase enzyme would break down maltose into 2 glucose molecules. So again, maltase, sucrase, and lactase would all be active if you ate, breakfast cereal, especially put some table sugar on it, and you had some milk, right? So again, we have these different enzymes that break down different carbohydrates, but ultimately what gets produced are these monosaccharides in the small intestine. So it's like the bigger molecules, bigger starchy carbs, the disaccharides, all of those get broken down into the monosaccharides, glucose, fructose, and galactose. Then we have transporters that transport them across the intestine. You see those enterocytes there. Those are cells that line the small intestine. The monosaccharides get transported across the enterocytes, and finally they get absorbed into the bloodstream, okay? And then from the bloodstream, they can get carried by the portal vein to the liver, and then the liver may store some of that glucose as glycogen. Maybe the fructose and galactose get converted to glucose in the liver. Maybe some of that fructose gets converted to triglyceride, fat, right? So it all just depends on what the body needs. But the liver, kind of really has the first say there. Now, unabsorbed carbohydrates, like if there's any fiber in the small intestine, those unabsorbed carbohydrates, meaning the carbohydrates that don't cross over and get transported from the enterocytes and absorbed into the blood, unabsorbed carbohydrates like fiber is going to move on to the large intestine, okay? All right, so let's look here on this slide at the skeletal muscle uptake of glucose by the action of insulin or muscle contraction. So I mentioned earlier, you eat a high carbohydrate meal, pancreas, and you get those carbohydrates, glucose entering the blood, your pancreas starts to release insulin. And insulin signals liver cells, fat cells, and muscle cells, which you see here, to uptake glucose from the blood so that you can bring your blood sugar levels back down to a more normal level, right? Because you don't want the blood sugar staying high for hour after hour, day after day, week after week, right? If it is, then you're diabetic. So how does the glucose get into a cell here? Well, insulin is going to bind to the receptor when blood glucose levels are high. And then there's a whole bunch of different colored proteins and enzymes inside the muscle cell. Some of them you see IRS in green and PI3K, that's an enzyme. All these different colored molecules basically are part of what's called an intracellular signaling pathway. So when insulin binds to the receptor at the top there of that cartoon, it activates many of these enzymes, these proteins that are inside the muscle cell, and then this signaling cascade activates, if you follow all those arrows down, what's called GLUT4 translocation. So those little red transporters, they kind of look like they're in a circle there, but when insulin binds to the receptor and all those different proteins and enzymes inside the muscle cell kind of get switched on, they direct the GLUT4 transporters to translocate to the membrane, the cell membrane. And those GLUT4 transporters, they're called GLUT4 because they're glucose transporters. Once they're embedded in the cell membrane, insulin's directing them to go there through this intracellular signaling pathway. They can open up and they uptake and allow glucose to flow in from the blood and the interstitial fluid and enter into the muscle cell, okay? You also see calcium flowing in there as well too. But the main message here is that you eat carbs, blood glucose level goes up, pancreas releases insulin, insulin binds to the insulin receptor, activates various proteins and enzymes. A lot of this is done by phosphorylation inside the muscle cell. And then these enzymes and proteins basically direct the GLUT4 transporters, glucose transporters, to move to the cell membrane. And that provides a doorway for the glucose then to get into the cell. And of course, once the glucose is in the muscle cell, what's going to happen to it? Well, maybe if you're exercising, it gets broken down through glycolysis to make ATP to fuel muscle contraction. Maybe after a meal, you're just sitting around, you're not exercising, you're just relaxing. A bunch of glucose comes in through those glucose transporters. You start linking it together and you store glycogen. So there's an enzyme called glycogen synthase that directs that activity. It links all the glucose molecules together, and you can store that as glycogen so that you've got a fuel source available if you would happen to get up and, let's say, go exercise, okay? The other way that glucose, sugar from the blood, can get into muscle cells is muscle contraction stimulates its uptake. So on the right-hand side under contraction, you see inside the cell there's this organelle called the sarcoplasmic reticulum, okay? The sarcoplasmic reticulum stores a lot of calcium, all right? And calcium plays an important role It basically, in muscle contraction, okay, it signals, it provides a signal for muscle contraction to occur. Okay, so when your muscles are contracting, calcium is released from the sarcoplasmic reticulum. And there's also a molecule there in kind of bright yellow called AMPK. That's an enzyme. When calcium is released, like when your muscles are contracting in high amounts into the cytoplasm of the cell, that calcium can basically activate AMPK. And this enzyme then, if you follow the arrows down from AMPK, can cause those GLUT4 transporters to translocate to the cell membrane. And now you have those transporters embedded in the cell membrane where glucose can be uptaken into the cell. You see all those arrows coming from those little red balls of glucose. That's the glucose entering the cell from the GLUT4 transporters. Okay. But for those GLUT4 transporters to move to the cell membrane to uptake glucose, again, you've got to work your way back up the pathway. It's like muscles are contracting, calcium's being released from the sarcoplasmic reticulum, that switches on AMPK. There's other things that can switch on AMPK too, and it's a little more complex than this, but ultimately, then that AMPK can direct those GLUT4 transporters to move to the cell membrane so you can take in glucose, right? And the reason we need those glucose transporters is to be in the cell membrane. It provides like a doorway for the glucose to flow into the cell. Glucose can't just enter muscle cells. It can't just diffuse across the membrane without the help of a transport molecule, okay? So once glucose enters the muscle cell through a transporter, and I should mention, like I said, muscle uses GLUT4 transporter to uptake glucose. Fat cells also use GLUT4. The liver uses GLUT2. Neurons in the brain, I think they use GLUT1. So there's a different numbering system and different GLUT transporters that are used in different cells. But primarily I'm talking about muscle here. So in muscle, that glucose enters through that GLUT4 transporter. Then once glucose comes in, there's an enzyme called hexokinase that during exercise plays a role in converting that glucose molecule into glucose 6-phosphate. And then that glucose 6-phosphate could be broken down through glycolysis during exercise to produce ATP to fuel muscle contraction, okay? Also, and really no matter what, once glucose comes into the cell through that transporter, hexokinase is going to act on it, no matter if you're at rest or during exercise, because what hexokinase does is it tacks a phosphate molecule onto glucose, and by doing that, glucose gets trapped in the muscle cell. The muscle wants it to stay there so it can be used as a fuel source for muscle contraction, or that glucose 6-phosphate could get converted to glycogen, and that's glycogen synthesis for converting the glucose 6-phosphate, linking a bunch of molecules together. We form and store glycogen. So glycogen synthesis, there's an enzyme called glycogen synthase that's responsible for that whole process. All right, let's talk about the glycemic index of foods. The glycemic index of a carbohydrate source specifies the rate at which glucose levels rise in the blood after consumption of 50 grams of carbohydrate in a food compared with the ingestion of 50 grams of glucose. So the glycemic index is a scale going all the way up to 100. Pure glucose is given a glycemic index score of 100, okay? The glycemic score for a food is largely determined by how quickly ingested carbohydrate empties from the stomach and is absorbed into the blood from the small intestine. Foods can be classified as low GI foods or high GI foods. So the low GI foods that we eat, they have slow absorption rates. So blood sugar levels are not impacted. Your blood sugar level doesn't rise at the same rate and the same level as if you ingested high GI foods, okay? So the low GI foods, again, they're absorbed more slowly from the small intestine into the blood. So like the glucose from brown rice, whole grain pasta, multigrain breads. The high GI foods, glucose from these high GI foods is absorbed from the small intestine into the blood at faster rates. So you get a bigger spike in blood sugar, and you're going to have more insulin released as a result to get that sugar into your cells. So the high GI foods are things like table sugar, found in sports drinks, pop, soda pop, refined white rice, I should say pasta, not past, and mashed potatoes. Those all promote a pronounced but transient rise in both blood glucose and insulin production. So dietary carbohydrate, as I've mentioned, is a vital component of exercise preparation, performance, and recovery. The carbohydrate requirement for many athletes is increased because of the repetitive nature of their training, right? So you're an athlete, you may have practices all week, Monday through Friday. You may be a runner, you're running 5-6 days a week. Because you're training frequently, it's important to keep your carbohydrate levels up so that you have plenty of stored glycogen, plenty of glucose to fuel your activity, right? During periods of intense physical training, an athlete's daily carbohydrate intake may exceed 10 grams, may even go up to 12 grams of carbohydrate per kilogram of body weight. So that's a lot of carbohydrate to eat per day. But again, think about it. You're burning carbohydrates if you're going on these long runs. You're cycling long distances, so you're burning a lot of glycogen that's found in your muscle and liver. You're using some blood glucose, so you've got to replenish that. And depending on the intensity of exercise that you're doing and the duration, that really is going to play a role in dictating how many grams and how much carbohydrate you need to replenish the glycogen and glucose that you burn during exercise. And I'll talk about that in more detail in another episode. Athletes can take advantage of high and lower glycemic carbohydrate food to optimize performance. So a lot of times athletes on a day-to-day basis will eat the lower glycemic carbs, your whole grain rice, whole grain breads, eat the lower glycemic carbs on a day-to-day basis. But then after, after running a marathon or after, prolonged exercise or higher intensity exercise, a lot of times that's the time to ingest your higher glycemic carbohydrates that really get absorbed rapidly from the small intestine into the blood and really help to replenish the glycogen you've burned off and glucose during that exercise. Consumption of high glycemic index carbohydrate sources is paramount to maintenance of blood glucose levels during prolonged aerobic endurance exercise. So high glycemic index carbs are also important for rapid recovery, as I just mentioned on the previous slide, of any muscle glycogen that you may burn from an exercise bout. So again, after exercise, that's where, taking in those high glycemic index carbs can be beneficial to replenish that glycogen you've burned from the muscle. Athletes can eat lower glycemic index carbs that are more slowly absorbed. These tend to be unrefined, complex carbohydrates to optimize their muscle glycogen stores between exercise bouts. So eating these more on like a daily basis. Ingestion of lower glycemic index carbohydrate prevents dramatic fluctuations in blood glucose while maintaining an extended low-level blood glucose exposure to the previous exercise muscle during prolonged recovery. Glycemic load. Now, this is a more detailed way to evaluate the effect of carbohydrate on food, carbohydrate food on the body. So the glycemic load, this combines the glycemic index, which I talked about previously, with the amount of carbohydrate contained in a serving of a specific food. Okay, so the amount of carbohydrate combined with its glycemic index score. Okay. A food with a high glycemic index and a high glycemic load will have a greater effect on blood glucose than a food with the same glycemic index but a lower glycemic load because of the large carbohydrate content of the first food. So here's an example to explain that. I think it'll be more clear after we go through this example. So rice and watermelon, two different foods, they both have the same glycemic index score of 72. So they would both be considered high glycemic index foods because as you get closer to 100, those are higher glycemic index foods, okay? So rice and watermelon both have a high GI, or both high GI foods, a GI score of 72. But a serving size, 150 grams of rice, provides 42 grams of carbohydrate, Whereas a serving of watermelon, which is 120 grams, provides only 6 grams of carbohydrate. So although rice and watermelon have the same glycemic index and they're high GI foods, there's a lot more grams of carbohydrate coming from rice than there are grams of carbohydrate coming from watermelon. The glycemic load is a practical tool that helps people with diabetes select foods that will help improve control of circulating blood glucose levels, right? So, eating lower glycemic load foods could help control and keep blood glucose levels lower, as opposed to the high glycemic load foods are going to tend to have a more rapidly increase blood glucose levels. So although a high glycemic index food such as rice can lead to large elevations in blood glucose, a serving of watermelon would result in less elevation because of what I just mentioned in that example, because of the glycemic load of it being lower. All right, so this chart just shows the glycemic index and glycemic loads of various foods. So the type of food, they're in kind of gray and white. The first column, you see that, peanuts, bean sprouts, grapefruit, brown rice, oatmeal, mac and cheese, yummy. White rice, sugar, your table sugar, white bread, watermelon. And then you see the glycemic index is in the middle column, and then the glycemic load is on the far right. Now remember, this scale goes up to 100. Pure glucose has a glycemic index score of 100, because if you ingest pure glucose, right, it's going to get into the small intestine rapidly, be absorbed very quickly into the blood, and you get a big spike in blood sugar. So it's pure glucose. So it has a rating of 100. Any foods that are 70 or above, those are categorized as high glycemic index foods. Moderate glycemic index foods have a score of 55 to 70. You see those in orange. And then the low GI foods that are in green, those have a score of less than 55. So the foods in green have less of an impact on your blood sugar, right? They're absorbed more slowly from the small intestine into the blood, so you're not going to get as big of a spike, acute spike in blood sugar if you're eating more of those low GI foods, right? Things like grapefruit, apples, carrots, oranges, bananas. You see a lot of, fruits, vegetables there. And then you look at, let's say, the glycemic index for the moderate GI foods in orange, candy bars, oatmeal, ice cream. So you're starting to creep up a little bit. And then we get into the reds, your white bread, popcorn, baked potato, pure glucose. But again, the glycemic index is one component to look at, but also it's important to look at the glycemic load, because then that entails not only the glycemic index, but the amount of carbohydrate coming from each of these different types of food. And remember, those with lower amounts of carbohydrate in the food are going to have a lower glycemic load, whereas those with more grams of carbohydrate are going to have a higher glycemic load and tend to cause a more rapid spike in blood sugar. Okay. So what are daily carbohydrate recommendations? Well, the RDA for carbohydrates is 130 grams per day. So that's the recommendation for 97 and 98% of the population. That's just, not like athletes. You need at least 130 grams per day. You need at least 50 to 100 grams of carbohydrate, which is equivalent to 3 to 5 slices of bread per day to prevent ketosis. So let's talk a bit about this, ketosis. Some people intentionally want to enter ketosis, like if they're on a ketogenic diet. So in a ketogenic diet, this is a very low carbohydrate diet, okay? So typically the percentages are about 75% of the food you eat is coming from fat in a day, 20% is coming from protein, and the remaining 5% or less is carbohydrate. So only 5% of your total daily calories with the ketogenic diet are coming from carbohydrate, very low carbohydrate intake. And typically that's around, less than 50 to 100 grams per day, right? If you're eating less than 50 to 100 grams of carbohydrates per day, there's some changes that occur in your body. The body says, well, I don't have carbohydrate available to keep my blood glucose levels up. So what has to happen? Well, the liver can make glucose from non-carbohydrate sources like amino acids, pyruvate, lactate, glycerol, and also fat cells, because you're not eating as much carbohydrate, they undergo what's called lipolysis. So they start releasing their stored triglyceride. That stored triglyceride is released as glycerol and fatty acids into the blood. The glycerol and fatty acids circulate to the liver. The glycerol could be converted to glucose to help keep your blood glucose up since you're not eating very many carbohydrates. The fatty acids can be converted in the liver into what are called ketones, like beta-hydroxybutyrate. So these ketones then are dumped out of the liver into the blood, and there's various cells and tissues of the body that can use those ketones as a fuel source: the brain, the heart, muscles. So again, ketones is an alternate fuel source when you're eating like a very low carbohydrate diet. Maybe you're fasting or you're starving because you're stranded on an island somewhere. We have this backup mechanism to fuel the body through ketosis when you're not ingesting a lot of carbohydrates, right? And people ask me all the time, well, is a ketogenic diet good, bad? I mean, you're going to be able to maintain your blood sugar levels because we have other ways the liver can make its own sugar through the process I just described, and we can run on these ketones as fuel, and you will lose body fat because you're literally releasing fat if you're in ketosis and you've lowered that carbohydrate intake, because you've got to have some fuel source for your body to run on. So you run on ketones and you run on the oxidation of fat, burning fat. That all sounds great, right? Like, man, I can burn more fat, I can form these ketones, I can still keep my blood sugar up. But sometimes it's very difficult to adhere to that ketogenic diet, right? Because you start craving carbs. Some people, they may not feel as energetic on this diet. They may struggle to exercise intensely because, again, during high intensity exercise, our cells really prefer glycogen and glucose to make ATP, to make energy, right? And so you may notice that your intensity of exercise drops off. Some people do well on it, though. Again, it's just kind of personal. Like, can you adhere to it or not? Okay, can you stick with that diet or not? If you feel great and your goal is to lose weight and you're losing weight and your body composition is improving and you don't feel like your performance has taken a hit as far as your exercise or your training, or maybe it's game day competition, do it. But again, the one con that I think you have to think about when you're not taking in a lot of carbs is it could have an impact on your ability to sustain performing high intensity exercise. Okay, so your performance may be a bit impaired when your carbohydrate intake's really low. All right, so the Food and Nutrition Board recommends carbohydrate intake should range from 45% to 65% of total daily calorie intake. So that RDA above, it's kind of like the bare minimum. They recommend like 130 grams a day. Food and Nutrition Board says, 45 to 60% of the calories you eat each day should be coming from carbs. So for example, let's say that you've calculated or figured that you need to eat 2,000 calories per day to maintain weight, okay? How many grams of carbohydrates should you eat per day to stay in that 45 to 65% range? Remember now, this is important for the calculation. This goes way back to one of the first slides. 1 gram of carbohydrate is equivalent to 4 calories of energy, okay? So to calculate this, to find out how many grams of carbohydrate you should eat per day, on the low end, 45%, you would multiply that by 2,000 total calories. So 0.45 times 2,000 would give you 900 calories. You divide that by 4 calories because that's how many calories are in a gram of carbohydrate. That gives you 225 grams. So that's the grams of carbohydrate you would need to eat if you're on a 2,000 calorie a day diet to be at 45% of your calories coming from carbohydrate. Now, the high end, 65%. You take 0.65, multiply that by 2,000 total calories per day. That would give you 1,300 calories of calories coming from carbohydrate. Divide 1,300 by 4 calories per gram of carbohydrate, which means you would see a total of 325 grams of carbohydrates would need to be consumed so that you're at 65% of your total daily calories coming from carbohydrate per day. Okay. Now, many Americans are sedentary and consume too many foods high in calories from carbohydrates and fats. So why do I say this? Well, if you're sedentary and you're in a caloric surplus, you're overeating carbs, you're overeating fats, which if you look at the American diet, a lot of foods we eat have a high amount of carbohydrate and a high amount of fat. Donuts, ice cream, cheeseburgers, French fries, these are all high carb, high fat foods, right? And if you're eating a lot of those and you're in a caloric surplus, yeah, you're bound to gain weight. You're going to gain body fat, okay? Most Americans would do well to lower their carbohydrate and fat intake, keep the protein intake high, always keep protein intake high. So, yeah, sedentary American, you're not burning a lot of carbohydrate. You're not burning off much glycogen in your muscle. You're not burning much glycogen in your liver. And then if you're eating a lot of carbohydrate and a lot of fat, you're going to be storing more fat and you're not burning anything. So your body's just in this storage mode, okay? So for most Americans, I would say, I'm not like anti-carb. I'm not a anti-carb, zealot, but it's like most Americans would do well to lower their carbohydrate. I'm not saying you have to go on a ketogenic diet, and only eat 50 grams of carbs a day or, drastically reduce carbs. But, eating on the lower end, 40 to 45%, 45% carbohydrate intake per day, that would suit most Americans well. And there's studies that show high carbohydrate diets, like once you start eating more than 65% of your total daily calories, you're consuming more than 65% of your total daily calories from carbs, that tends to promote the features of atherogenic dyslipidemia, such as elevated triglycerides and lower HDL cholesterol. So what does that mean? Well, once your carbohydrate intake gets really high, above 65% of your total daily calories, especially if you're sedentary, because athletes actually need higher carbohydrate intakes to fuel performance. But if you're sedentary, your carbohydrate intake is high. Again, some of these carbs may get converted to triglyceride, so that's going to raise triglyceride levels in the blood, fat levels in the blood. You may have higher levels of LDL cholesterol, with the typical American diet, and LDL tends to get stuck in blood vessel walls and forms plaque, and that can impair blood flow to the heart and brain and other tissues. So cardiovascular disease. And then also high carb diets may lower your high density lipoprotein cholesterol. So what is that? HDL. High density lipoprotein is a carrier, right? Like a vehicle in the blood that carries cholesterol from the periphery in a reverse manner back to the liver so it can be broken down. So this is why it's called good cholesterol. You want a lot of high density lipoprotein carriers available. You want high levels of that to carry cholesterol from the periphery, the peripheral blood vessels, the peripheral cells back to the liver to break it down. That helps keep your cholesterol lower. And that's a good thing. But you're going to have less of those carriers, those high density lipoproteins, if the carbohydrate intake gets too high. Okay, it's been shown to lower the HDL levels. All right. Now, athletes, recommendations here are different than for somebody that's just general population, maybe more sedentary, right? Athletes may benefit from consuming more carbohydrate each day to fuel training and performance. Why? Well, they're not sedentary, they're athletes. They've got training bouts, they may have multiple training sessions in a day, they may have a weight training workout, they may have some running, they may have practice, practicing skills for whatever sport. So there's a lot of activity throughout the day. Runners, endurance athletes engage in prolonged exercise at different intensities. So they're burning through a lot of carbohydrate during those activities, muscle glycogen, liver glycogen, blood glucose. So it needs to be replenished, right? And they're burning through more carbohydrate than the average sedentary American. So let's talk about recommendations for athletes. It's important first to consider the athlete's training program. So 7 to 10 grams per kilogram of body weight is recommended, meaning 7 to 10 grams of carbohydrate per kilogram of body weight is recommended for aerobic endurance athletes, so distance runners, road cyclists, triathletes, for example, who train more than 90 minutes per day, right? So these, if they're doing extended duration training sessions, should be taking in 7 to 10 grams of carbohydrate per kilogram of body weight per day. So I could figure that real quick. What would it be for me, right? So you might wonder, well, kilograms, how do I figure that? So I weigh about 175 pounds. So 175, you take your weight in pounds, divide by 2.2, because 1 kilogram is equal to 2.2 pounds. So if you want to get your weight in kilograms, take your weight in pounds, divide by 2.2. So I weigh 79.55 kilograms. So we'll just round that to 80. So if I were an endurance athlete, which I'm not currently running over 90 minutes per day, but I'd take my weight in kilograms, 80, I'll just multiply it on the low end times 7 grams of carbohydrate per kilogram of body weight. I would want to be taking in 560 grams of carbohydrate per day when I'm engaging in these long duration activities, okay? Now, sometimes I do lift weights for 90 minutes in a day, but again, weight training is intermittent, right? I do a set, doesn't even last maybe 15, 20, 30 seconds, and then I have several minutes of rest. So that's an intermittent activity. It's not like I'm continuously exercising for more than 90 minutes, okay? So as somebody that's involved in that type of activity, I don't need as much carbohydrate, which I'll get to that in a minute. But if you're doing continuous prolonged exercise, the higher carbohydrate intake is important. And part of the reason for that is a 2-hour bout of intense aerobic exercise may almost entirely deplete stored glycogen in the liver and working muscles, right? So if you just, depending on the intensity, and you go on a 2-hour run, if you're not supplementing it with any carbohydrate during that run, you could, if it's intense enough, deplete the glycogen in your liver and in your working muscles. And yeah, you're going to be very fatigued. Your performance is going to drop off. You may even just have to stop, okay? 7 to 10 grams of carbohydrate per kilogram of body weight should replenish skeletal muscle glycogen levels within 24 hours. So if you did deplete your skeletal muscle glycogen levels during a long, extended, 2.5 hour bout of aerobic exercise, by taking in 7 to 10 grams of carbohydrate per kilogram of body weight, you can replenish all of that glycogen you burned from that prior exercise bout, okay? Now, if an athlete is an anaerobic athlete, someone that participates in strength training, maybe a sprinter, maybe it's, a sport that's more anaerobic, like football or, basketball, which does have an aerobic component too. But again, you get the general idea here. Less carbohydrate is needed for these athletes. So 5 to 6 grams of carbohydrate should be consumed per kilogram body weight for these types of athletes, okay? Studies have shown that there's only a 24 to 40% depletion of skeletal muscle glycogen when performing 1 hour of high-intensity strength training. So that's, as I mentioned, that's the reason why not as much carbohydrate is needed for strength training athletes as, say, aerobic endurance athletes, right? You just don't burn through as much because that strength training is intermittent. I mean, no one is moving a bar for an hour or an hour and a half continuously, right? So it's just a different metabolic stress than aerobic endurance training, so less carbohydrate. And if you have any questions for me, you can contact me about the KU Exercise Program, KU Exercise Science Program. Contact me at 913-897-8516. That's my office phone. Or you can email me questions to jtaylor@ku.edu. Hope you have a better understanding of carbohydrates, and I'll have a couple more episodes coming out on carbohydrates and fueling the body in the fed state, fasted state, and during exercise, and then some more recommendations with carbohydrate intake for athletes.